good to be with you this morning. If you will, open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12 will be the first place we look in just a moment. I believe that Sarah and Lily will be traveling back today from Georgia for the funeral of her grandmother. Tamika said that she was worshiping with her family back over in Smithfield today, so that's where she is. And I mentioned, I think it was on Wednesday last week, we have a friend down in Florida who is our age who had breast cancer. One of her surgery incisions got infected. She was readmitted to the hospital yesterday for that. She mentioned this morning that she is responding well to the antibiotics. If that does continue, then they'll just continue with antibiotics. If it does not continue to work, then they will have to do another operation to try to take care of that infection. So if you will, please remember them in your prayers. Matthew chapter 12, look with me there in verse 34 and verse 35. Jesus states there that for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good person out of the good treasures brings forth good, and the evil person out of the evil treasures bring forth evil. On Wednesday, for those who were here, we had mentioned that our topic for this morning is going to be that inner monologue that we have with ourselves. Heard a story of a girl who was 14 and ended up going to a psychiatrist believing that she was the only person in the world who heard voices in her head, meaning that just her own internal conversations. She thought she was the only person in the world who had those internal conversations. And that conversation is what we want to talk about this morning. Our inner thoughts, the conversations that we have with ourselves, is one of the biggest deciding factors on the actions that we take in our lives. We talk ourselves into and out of actions all the time, but not only does our internal monologues change the way that we act, it also just more or less changes how we view the world around us. It shapes how we view people and society as a whole. The way that we speak to ourselves about other people and about society as a whole shapes our perception of this life. We mentioned on Wednesday that many times people believe or seem to believe that internal thought process is something that is outside of our control. But that internal thought process is us. And Jesus, speaking of that internal dialogue, he makes the point there in Matthew chapter 12 that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And from what the mouth speaks, the body follows along with it. And so what we need to do is make sure, as we look there in verse 35, that we bring forth the abundance of good rather than the abundance of evil. And what I'd like to do this morning is to talk about a couple different internal monologues that we tend to have. As we progress not only through our day but through our lives, that internal dialogue shifts. We might be all joy and roses one second and just doom and gloom the next second. That's kind of how we tend to be as humans, where we change that around. And there are, I'm just going to go ahead and label them as characteristics or personas that we put on. Whenever we talk to people, we put on a persona usually. We make up an individual we present to others. And even we do that internally, where we adopt a persona, we adopt a character, and that character then kind of dictates our lives to some degree. And the first one we'll talk about is the pessimist. The pessimist is the person who talks in our heads, and I hate to say it, it sounds so weird when I say that. Internally, in my head, that sounds great. Outward, it sounds weird. But whenever we let the internal pessimist be the person who dictates that internal conversation, we usually fall into a couple of main categories of thinking. The internal persona is characterized, that pessimist is characterized by telling ourselves that things aren't going to work out. That whatever our current struggle is, whatever conflict that we are temporarily having, is a conflict that's going to last forever, that it's never going to end, that the current problem is just going to stretch on forever. We tell ourselves that there is no happy ending, that there's no light at the end of the tunnel, that just what we currently are dealing with is what we will always deal with. The future is nothing that holds anything good, other than a series of obstacles that will continue to grind us to a pulp, as our internal conversation tells us. The pessimist inside of us will tell us that no one likes us or no one truly cares for us. We view ourselves as relatively worthless to others. and we refuse to tell ourselves that we are valuable. Though our thoughts in these conversations we have with ourselves, we degrade ourselves, we beat ourselves up, and we tear ourselves down. Turn with me to John chapter 16. John chapter 16. Jesus and his apostles have been through a lot together. And here they are at the last feast, the last supper together. And Jesus is delivering to them the information that they need to get through the next few days and weeks and months and years of their lives. Now, they had just entered into Jerusalem that week as a triumphal procession. Individuals taking off their cloaks and laying palm fronds before them. Everything seemed to just work out right. They asked, where should we prepare the meal? And Jesus says, well, just go into town and you'll find a man. He'll have a room all ready for you. Go grab a donkey. It's just standing there waiting for you. Everything seemed to be pre-planned. But after chapter 16, everything is going to turn in the opposite direction. They're going to go from the very best days of their life to the very worst hours of their life. And what Jesus says here in verse 33 of chapter 16 is, these things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And turn with me to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4. There in verse 8. Philippians chapter 4, there in verse 8. He says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's anything excellent, if there's anything worthy of praise, meditate on these things. Paul is speaking from a very low point in his life. Low, maybe not mentally. He makes the point very clearly throughout the entire book that he is of good cheer, that he is rejoicing in the things that he is going through. But physically, all the trials, all the torment that he's going through. He mentions in chapter 1 that he's imprisoned. And in chapter 2, he's still waiting his fate to find out what's going to happen. Individuals on both sides of the fence seem to be after Paul to make things worse on him. And he mentions here in chapter 4 that our internal monologue, that diatribe that we speak to ourselves, that conversation we have, that either motivates us or degrades us, that conversation should be changed in verse 8 to things that are true and honorable, things that are just and pure, things that are lovely and commendable. Jesus over in John chapter 16 tells us to be of good cheer and to remember that he's already overcome the world. And through him, as Paul mentions in Romans chapter 8, we are more than conquerors through him. Paul tells us to meditate on the things that are good and commendable and lovely. We need to rein in our negative thoughts about ourselves and others and this life. Through Christ there is hope and a bright future despite all the temporary missteps or misfortunes we are currently going through. Paul mentions over in Romans that this light, or 2 Corinthians, this light momentary affliction is not even worth comparing to the glory that will be. That bright light at the end of the tunnel, that hope, that prize that we strive for, that we cannot be pessimistic in those things. The second persona, as you turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the second persona that seems to talk to us quite a bit is the individual who is the defeatist. This person says things like, I will never succeed in life. I will never amount to anything. I'm stupid. I have nothing to do but mess-ups. What's the point of trying if I'm just going to fail anyways? And when we talk to ourselves in this way, we consume ourselves with ourselves. And really, it's a form of egotism. And we don't really talk about egotism in the negative sense. We always talk about it in the positive sense. I'm so great, I'm going to be able to do all this because I'm a wonderful person. But egotism is really just being self-consumed with yourself. And that's both in a positive sense and in a negative sense, where I am so fixated on who I am and what I can do and what I cannot do. Egotism works in both ways. And the defeatist becomes an individual who is self-consumed with what I can't do, what I've already failed at, or what I will never be able to achieve. Paul here in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 8 and verse 9, speaks to us from a very low point in his life. He mentions way back in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 that the time that he writes this, he was so utterly burdened beyond his ability that he despaired of life itself. And then here in chapter 12, he speaks of whatever this thorn in the flesh is that has driven him to plead with God for 3 times to remove it from him. And the answer that's given here in verse 9 and in verse 10 is not, Paul, you are a strong individual, you can persevere through this, you'll make it because you have all of these abilities. What he's given there in verse 9 is, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Paul replies then with his internal thought process in verse 9, therefore I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest fully upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weaknesses and insults and hardships, persecutions and calamities, for when I am weak, then I am strong. And if you are there in Corinthians, turn a couple pages back to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and 2 Corinthians chapter 12 go so well together. When we think about our abilities and what we have, it's often because we look at somebody else who has more or different abilities than we do, and we wish we had what they had, or we are not anything compared to what they are. And Paul makes this point there in verse 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there in verse 14, he says, for the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? Or the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God has arranged the members in the body, each one of them, as he chose. If all were a single member, where would be the body? As it is, there are many parts and yet one body. As has been stated so many times, God does not make mistakes. And he did not make a mistake when he made you. He has given you the abilities to fit into the work of the church and his purposes for his working. And it is not up to me to say, well, I don't amount to anything because I don't have this ability or that ability. I haven't succeeded in this way or that way, so therefore I'm worthless as an individual. God has chosen to give you all of your strengths and all of your weaknesses for you to work as effectively as he needs you to. And we let that individual, that defeatist person, speak in our minds and reign the conversation where we believe we aren't going to amount to anything because we don't have the abilities. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that it's not all about us. It's not all about my abilities and what I can do and what I'm capable of. Paul, with all of his strengths, with all of the great things that he did, Jesus does not answer there in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, yes, Paul, you can do it because you're great. He makes the point that you can do it because my strength is made perfect in weaknesses, and my grace is sufficient for you. And when we get consumed with that thought process, well, I can't do it because I don't have the right or enough abilities, Paul makes a point in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that God has so composed the body that he's made you exactly as he's made you in order for you to complement someone who's lacking in those areas. The third persona, the third person that we often talk to ourselves in is the cynic. The cynic is the one who the conversations are dominated by being highly critical of humanity and the culture that's around us. Those internal dialogues and diatribes become fault-finding missions. We revel in the criticism of others, and their short-sightedness or their lack of education or their foolishness in a variety of ways. We talk to ourselves about the hopelessness of the future and those who make the future happen. This is usually the inner dialogue that I see when people start to voice about politics. Everything's bad, both sides of the party are wrong, there's never going to be anything ever good again. They're cynical about the world around them. These monologues not only breed a mentality of despair, but they also cultivate an indifference towards others. by making blanket statements about the left or the right or those outside or those inside the church. We make snap judgments and we fail to see the people, the actual people behind what we perceive as their faults. We judge them according to our own impressions, and we never bother to see the person, their value, or their motivations or intentions. We lose hope, and when we lose hope, we also lose motivation to help shape the future, a better future for those who are in our influence, our sphere of influence. We paint the world in a whitewash of despair, and we remove ourselves as being a part of the solution. If all I do is become cynical and say, well, this is terrible and this person had made these mistakes, what we do is we have made ourselves a judge, jury, and executioner sometimes. And by being the judge of the situation, I'm not the person who has to make those things right. I'm not the person who has to change them. I just have to point out the faults for everybody else. If you're there in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, one page over into chapter 13, there in verse 7, Paul, in talking to a congregation that's rife with struggles and rife with problems, individuals who could be easily cynical towards others around them, he makes this point there in verse 7, love bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, and endures all things. Peter makes this point as you move over to 1 Peter chapter 3. There in 1 Peter chapter 3, we're going to look at verses 8 and in verse 9. Peter says, finally, all of you have unity of mind and sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, a humble mind. Do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless. For to this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. Peter uses that phrase a couple times in chapter 2 and chapter 3 and later on in chapter 5, that to this you were called. And one of the things he mentions there in chapter 3, we are called to be a blessing to other people. And by being cynical, by being despaired about others, becoming overly consumed with faults and problems, we fail to ever see the individual and fail to see how we can be a blessing in their life. We can't have the Christian attitudes and actions towards others without a Christ-like love for others. I can't expect to look at others and be cynical about the world around us and all their problems and all their faults and still have a Christian, a Christ-like action towards them. Actions flow from what's in the heart. Jesus says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. I can't be a Christ-like blessing without a Christ-like action. And I can't do that by being cynical towards the world around me. The next to last one I would like to mention, or the next to last one, however that goes, is the individual who is the classical egotist. The individual who looks at the world around them and thinks, well, I can do this. It's the individual whose inner dialogue is consumed with themselves and often comparing themselves with others and their abilities and others' failures. When we listen to that inner egotist, we become fixated with our own abilities. I can do this because I'm talented or smart, or I'm clever. I'm able to do this because I have all the skills and the abilities that I need to achieve this or that. When we look at the world in those terms, we look at others who struggle in areas that we're not currently struggling in. And oftentimes we make statements either mentally or out loud. I can't believe that person's struggling in this way. How could they ever not understand this particular aspect of life? What's wrong with people? And even if we don't verbalize it, we take our time to compare ourselves to them and think, I'm doing all right. Compared to those individuals, I'm doing pretty great. Paul speaks to individuals like this over in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, if you will look me there in verse 12. Paul here is defending his ministry against those who parade themselves around as being better apostles, or as he mockingly calls them over in later chapter 11, super apostles. He says, but when they measure themselves by one another and they compare themselves with one another, they're without understanding. One of the major faults with comparing ourselves to somebody else is almost always invariably who we choose to compare ourselves with. When we look around, we say, well, I'm better than the people around me. I'm doing all right. I'm doing better than others. We don't really compare ourselves with a good standard. We almost always find someone who has a bit more of a public or well-known problem or struggle. We find someone who their talents are sometimes underwhelmed by their shortcomings. We find someone who their faults are areas that we shine in. When we compare ourselves, even if it is just inside of our own minds, we like to shine. And we always find someone to compare ourselves to that we will shine in comparison to. But even in that, we're not honest with ourselves. We're not honest in comparing ourselves with others, because whenever I compare myself to someone else, I hardly ever point out all of my own faults. I conveniently forget those. And I don't compare myself to all of their good qualities and all of their strengths, because all I want to do is compare myself to their faults. I want to take all of my good characteristics and compare it to all of their negative characteristics, because I still want to look good, even if it's only in my own mind. But more than those two things, we fail to see that our strengths are almost always someone else's weaknesses, and their weaknesses are their strengths are our weaknesses. No one is talented and capable in all ways. No one has ever been designed by God to be perfect in all areas. No one is as wise in all ways that other people aren't. God has designed us to complement one another in our abilities and our strengths, not to compete against one another. And sometimes when the egotist speaks in those long monologues in our head, we are consumed with what I deserve or what I have earned. All that I am and all that I can be is by God's gift and by His grace. All that I have achieved has been with the help of somebody else. I have done and cannot do anything completely independently. If all that I am and all that I do and all that I can be and all that I have has come at the help or the hands of somebody else, what do I really have to be arrogant about? Over in James chapter 4, he begins there in verses 1 down to verse 3 to describe the conflicts and the strife that happens in their group because of their own selfish desires. That internal dialogue of I want, therefore I will have. Or I deserve, therefore I will take. And his answer to that is in verse 6 and in verse 10. He says in verse 6, but he gives more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble. And there in verse 10, therefore humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. We can't face the world around us with pride and arrogance and expect to be the servants that Christ expects us to be. That's one of the main struggles we see there in 2 Corinthians, are individuals who parade themselves as I'm a better apostle than Paul is because I'm going to make you serve me. And Paul comes back and says, well, no, it doesn't make you a better apostle, it makes you a worse apostle. What makes you a better servant of Christ is to be a servant to one another. And I can't do that if I'm consumed with how great I am and what I deserve and what I need. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul speaks of the same idea. There in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and in verse 4. Paul states it this way, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourselves. Let each one of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. I mean, we should be thinking about others in a way to esteem them more highly than ourselves. Our internal conversations can't be belittling or degrading to others, but it should be how can I help them in those ways. There's no way that I can have a servant's heart without a servant's mentality towards myself and a true love and zeal for others around me. Turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 4. The next to last one I would like to mention is the overachiever. The overachiever dialogue is usually comes in two major ways. The first line of thinking revolves around the person believing that they will never do enough. They're always plagued with a sense of inadequacy for not doing enough, not working hard enough, not accomplishing enough. One might classify this as the inadequate overachiever. That I want to do more than I can do, but still after I've done all that, I still can't feel like I've done anything. That's a problem. That monologue puts pressure on ourselves to believe that our value is directly tied to how much we do. We fool ourselves into believing that God's love for us is dependent upon how much we can achieve. In 1 Peter chapter 4, there in verse 10, a verse we've gone over several times, as each one has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Peter makes a point in this chapter that each one of us has been given abilities and talents from God, and that we should use them to the best of our abilities to serve one another. But as Sarah always says, you can only do what you can do. That's it. You can't do more than you can do. And it takes wisdom and insight to realize, when have I done what I can do? When can you say, I've done a good day's work, and then be satisfied with that? That's an important thing, that important mental process that we should learn. To say that I have worked as much as I can, I have done wholehearted service to the Lord, and be okay with that. To not be pushed into believing that God will no longer love me if I haven't achieved X, Y, or Z, if I haven't done as much work as somebody else, or haven't achieved as much as somebody else, or haven't tried hard enough. We don't work because we try to achieve or earn God's love. We work because God loves us. Isn't the point that John makes over in 1 John chapter 4? That because God has loved us, then we then know how to love one another in areas of service and kindness and compassion. The second path of the overachiever is the idea of yes. I want to say yes to everything. I want to do all the work that can possibly be done. I will do all of it. The problem is that none of us are designed to do all the work all the time. I don't have the time, the energy, or the abilities to do everything. There are things that lie outside of my area of expertise. There are things that are best suited for you to do than for me. In the same way that there are things that may be better suited for me than they are for you, and that's perfectly fine. As you look over in Romans chapter 12 and here in 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter and Paul both speak of the idea that each one of us are given abilities. But if I try to overstep my bounds and to do all the work for everybody else, the job will not be done right, efficiently, and I will have robbed you of your ability to do the things that you need to do. Sometimes we fail to see that by overstepping our bounds, we rob each other of the blessings that it is to do the work that we are assigned to do. It's a huge thing. If I try to take on all the work all the time, where is your growth? Where is your benefit? And if you take all the work and I don't get to do all the work, get to do my work, then where is my growth? We see that a lot in maybe team sports. The individual who runs around the court or runs around the field trying to do everyone else's job, and you know what? That team always loses. Nobody on that team ever gets to really learn their position very well. And the person who tries to do it all, they do everything poorly. That's how it always works out, because the team is designed that I compliment you and you compliment me, and God has made the church work in the very same way. That if I try to achieve everything, I'll probably achieve hardly nothing. Not only that, whenever I'm running around trying to do all of everyone else's job, I usually neglect the things that really are my job. Turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We looked at the earlier verses in chapter 12. We'll look at verses 17 down through verse 20. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, starting there in verse 17. He asks the question, if the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? These are the verses we looked at a moment ago. That if I try to do everyone else's job, then I will have neglected my job. And I need to take some time to internally realize what's my area of influence. Where's the things that God has assigned me? Where's my areas where I shine? I need to do that work. I need to do to the best of my ability to serve one another to the glory of God and be satisfied with the work that I do. Recognizing that I don't work because I want to earn God's love. I work because I have God's love. The last attitude is really the balance of all of it. It's taking all the things we talked about and kind of combining them together. It is the Christian attitude, that Christian monologue. Turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Our thoughts as a Christian should be balanced. We should think about ourselves to make sure that we're doing what is right. But we all should be thinking of others and ways to serve them. Our thoughts should include love for God, his people, and a deep gratitude for all that he's blessed us with in this life. We should have a zeal and a readiness for our work as Christians, but we also should have a good perspective of what our responsibilities are. We need to be individuals who realize we cannot do everything. We should strive to have humility in our service and not feel superior even in our good works. We have to have hope for the future because God is the author and the sustainer of this life. We should have hope in others because God has the ability to do much with others. We should be truly thankful to him for that. Our hope and our faith are to be wrapped up fully in God and his abilities and not our abilities. And when we think things look dark and drear, we should remind ourselves that God is the author and the founder, the perfecter of all things. We should have faith in him and his power, which leaves nothing outside of his abilities. In large part, to be a Christian is to have our minds renewed after his image, to think the way that he thinks, to view other individuals as he views them, to view ourselves as he views us, both worthwhile and worthy of serving. Here in Romans chapter 12, there in verse 2, Paul says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." These are areas that I struggle with. I don't know what your inner monologues are. I've listed my 6 main ones. And really, in almost all the times that I sit down and I try to write a lesson is based off of what I struggle with and what I work on. All of these things are things that usually go through my mind on a weekly basis, where I feel that I'm inefficient because I haven't worked hard enough. That I need to do more to prove that I'm worthy of love to God. Times where I feel like I'm cynical to the world, where that there's just nothing I can do, that the world is just bent on destruction, and there's nothing that I can ever do to change it. And that in some way alleviates me from responsibility. Sometimes I feel like the defeatist, where I'm never going to amount to anything, that I'm never going to be worthy of anything. Sometimes I feel like the individual who's just the eternal pessimist, that the current struggle is always going to be my forever life. And maybe I'm the only one who feels this way, but I'm guessing I'm not. We are constantly challenged over in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 to renew our minds. Our minds are what drive our words. Our words are what produce our actions. We can change our actions, but until we change our hearts, we really, really, really won't change ourselves. The struggle to become a Christian, the best of our ability, starts with that internal struggle. The way that we speak to ourselves, about others and the world around us, not only changes our action, but it also changes our perception of the world. Take some time this week to ask yourselves what kind of inner monologues you've been having. Recognize the times where you veer off to being a pessimist, or being a cynical, or being defeatist, or being egotistical. Recognize the time where you're trying to be an overachiever and rein yourself back in. To find the balance that God has encouraged us to find. To find the humility and the love and the zeal and the passion for others. Dennis has picked out number 835. In a second, we'll sing number 835. We are called to be renewed in his image. That begins with first a commitment to change. So Peter makes the point over in Acts chapter 2 and verse 38 to repent. That's the commitment to change. And that's changed both our actions and our attitudes. To be baptized and then to remain faithful. And if we haven't been baptized or haven't remained faithful, we haven't accepted his grace or haven't changed in the way that we want to change, and you would like the prayers of the congregation, let us know as we stand and sing number 835.
There's a fountain.